Hi, I'm Linda Roggli, the founder of the AD Diva Network.
And I'm Terry Matlen, the author of The Queen of Distraction.
And we are delighted to host the second annual ADHD Women's Palooza. We are so delighted that you are here today because, as you know, we have an entire week's worth of riches, an entire encyclopedia for women's ADHD information. And this session is no exception. So we're going to get to that in just a moment, but I wanted to let you know that we are going to have more than 35 people, 35 sessions this week. That's more than 17 hours of information about women's ADHD. And this is not about parenting. This is about taking care of yourself. So this time we're going to talk about relationships. And I know that's something that's very important to many of us, all of us. We're in a relationship society, right? Melissa Orlov is going to talk to us about communication intimacy. And to that end, I just wondered, Terry, if you'd be willing to introduce our next guest.
I would love to. That would be quite an honor. I'm going to read this because I don't want to miss anything that Melissa has shared with us to share with you. So, Melissa Orlov is the author of 2 award-winning books. The first is The ADHD Effect on Marriage, which was published in 2010. And the second book, The Couple's Guide to Thriving with ADHD, published in 2014 with Nancy Kohlenberger. She is considered one of the foremost authorities on ADHD and relationships. A marriage consultant, Melissa helps ADHD-affected couples from around the world rebalance their relationships and learn to thrive. She also teaches marriage counselors and other professionals about effective marriage therapy for couples impacted by ADHD. Orlov blogs for Psychology Today and at www.adhdmarriage.com, where she also hosts a large community of adults learning about ADHD in relationships. She has been interviewed by the New York Times, CNN, Today, U.S. News and World Report, CBS, AOL, and American Psychological Association, Monitor, and many, many others. Ms. Orlov is a cum laude graduate at Harvard College. And on that exciting and very interesting note, I'd like to hand it over to you, Melissa. We're so thrilled to have you here today.
Well, thanks. I am delighted to be back for Palooza number 2. It's great.
Absolutely, absolutely. So tell us a little bit about what communication intimacy is and how that relates to ADHD.
A good way maybe to get into that is how I got interested in it in the first place, which was I was watching couples. As you teach couples about how ADHD impacts their relationship, there are a lot of changes they can make to make things better. And then there was this group that were getting past some of the ADHD symptoms, but then still having trouble connecting. And so I started to do some research about, what do you do to get that final step back into place, because some couples were able to do it and some couples were having trouble with it, and I was trying to figure out, what's the difference between them or whatever. And there's this model that was created by the Relationship Institute, which has to do with intimacy and how certain kinds of communication skills will improve your intimacy by the way that you use them. And so that's actually how I got interested in this topic, and I find that it works extremely well. I use this now in a lot of my counseling and talk about it to professionals and et cetera, and it works very well. You have to get the ADHD impact understood in order to be able to do it well. But it's a really good system. So that's how I got into it. And essentially what it is a certain skill set that you use to be able to talk to each other in a sort of a non-aggressive and also non-defensive listening kind of a way. There's certain kinds of things that you do in order to make that happen and essentially stabilize your communications. That's the fancy way of talking about it.
Okay.
So you start with self-intimacy. Is that how you start this skill set when you're working with ADHD couples?
Yeah, so actually I hand drew right before we got on a little chart, and excuse me for the fact that this is hand-drawn because I want to show it to everybody so they get a sense of where we are. Let's see if I can get this into the screen.
Oh,
so
good
you can
job.
See it. There we go.
There we go.
Almost.
A little
Let's see.
higher.
Up. Okay.
There you go. Perfect.
So it's like, if you think of it like a pyramid, at the bottom there's sort of 3 different kinds of intimacy, and at the bottom is the self-intimacy, And then in the middle, built on the self-intimacy, is the conflict intimacy. And then at the top is what's called affection intimacy. I've shorthanded that as AI because that's a little space, even though it's a really big thing, and that's actually what you're headed towards. So it is all built on the idea of self-intimacy, which is sort of knowing yourself and knowing what you're feeling, which is a skill set that a lot of people don't have. And one of the issues for people with ADHD is this question of do they self-assess as accurately as they could, and how do you build up that skill set? And so there are things that you can do, exercises you can do that help you identify your own feelings as they're happening, and there are all sorts of benefits for that. So this idea of being able to say what your feelings are, essentially, or understand what your feelings are, gives you two advantages. One is if you can read your feelings in the moment at the time they're happening, like I'm starting to feel annoyed or I'm starting to feel defensive or those kinds of things, you have a better chance of being able to address those yourselves, and B, you can also express them to your partner. And that's also really helpful to be able to express those to your partner so that you can then start a conversation around them. So it does start with self-intimacy.
So that sounds difficult because a lot of ADHD folks are completely oblivious. Maybe more so than other people. Maybe that's not right. You're the expert about that. But it seems to me that ADHD folks are so involved in their head and, making it through the day that they're not paying a lot of attention. Like, that's one reason I end up with bruises all over me because I don't pay attention to where my body is in space. I'm preoccupied with something else. My guess is that that's true with feelings. Do you find that to be true?
I do, and I think there's this sort of intense sort of in the momentness. You're talking about, running into things or whatever, and that's one manifestation of that. But so you can train yourself. I actually have, there's a word, a set of words, like a list of emotion words, and when I work with couples on this, I'll actually give them the list, and I'll say, look, several times a day, set an alarm so that it reminds you that for 2 or 3 minutes you're going to figure out what am I feeling exactly right now, and you just practice this. And I hear people, what they say is, it's really interesting to do this. I hadn't done it before, and suddenly you're feeling like, oh, I'm really excited, or I'm astounded, or I'm sad, or all this range of emotion that they just haven't, as you say, been focusing on. But that's a really important skill to be able to build up. Over time, you start to be able to do it more automatically, and you don't need the list of words and all that. But it is because then you can say to your partner, wow, that really astounds me, or that makes me feel sad, or something, and that becomes the basis of a really important conversation. And also, if you yourself are feeling sad, you can say, what do I need to do to get myself out of this? So yes, it is tricky, but people who don't have ADHD aren't all that great at that either. Women in general have more of this skill set than men do, just because as we grow up, this is sort of a vocabulary that we learn and we think about a lot. This is a gross generalization, but still a lot of people need work in this area, surprisingly.
I think this is really interesting. Melissa, could you give us some more examples of these exercises that you propose that couples do? And the second part of that question is it different if both people in the relationship have ADHD versus just one of the two?
Well, so both partners need to have the skill set. I'm starting with your second question first. And so it's just a question of whether or not they have, how mature is that skill set, essentially. And that varies by family background, by gender, by whether or not they have ADHD. ADHD is just one of many reasons they might have this skill set or not. And then in terms of the exercises, being able to name it is the very first step. And then there are other exercises that I like to work with couples in terms of being able to help them also name their feelings about themselves. So how do they feel, are they worthy of love? Are they, those kinds of things. What do they like? Who are they? What are their values? There are all sorts of different things there. But in terms of the self-intimacy that builds in that pyramid that I was talking about, where you have the you're moving up to affection, intimacy, and strong connections and all of that, the most important part is to be able to identify your feelings in the present moment. Another value for that, by the way, which I didn't mention before, is if you can identify a feeling that has been typically in the past leading to a bad conversational outcome, for example, defensiveness. If you can identify that you're starting to feel defensive and raise your hand and say, I'm starting to feel defensive right now, you can stop that conversation before that defensiveness gets in your way. So you can look at it, you can say, you can identify the feeling and sort of stand back from it a little bit and say, okay, I'm starting to feel this thing that doesn't work for me as well as it could in a conversation, so I'm going to choose to observe it without engaging with it quite so much. That's a form of mindfulness, which to some degree, if you think about identifying your feelings and being mindful of your feelings, it's a form of mindfulness as well. So anyway, so there are a series of things there that works for you. That's the sort of base of the pyramid. The really important part of of why and how you use this is actually as it applies to conflict intimacy, which is the middle of that pyramid.
So let's talk about conflict intimacy, because if I say to my partner I'm feeling, well, probably astounded, they wouldn't take too much issue with, but if I say I'm feeling angry or if I'm feeling something that potentially could cause conflict, how does that help? If I just say it, then what does that other person do with that? And I'm assuming that there's some kind of way that we have kind of non-aggressive relationship conversations to settle conflict. Yes?
Well, that's the whole idea. I mean, when you think of the word conflict and you think of the word intimacy, they don't really fit together. You're sort of like, yeah, exactly. Like, what is that all about? And that's actually the strength of this. So the idea of conflict intimacy is that you can talk about anything in a non-aggressive way, and you can listen to anything in a non-defensive way, and that anything that is said in that conversation is honored. Right? So there's this sense, for example, with the feeling of anger. Some people think you shouldn't be angry, but that's not it, actually. Anybody has a right to be angry. I mean, it's a warning signal that something's going on for you that's not working, and so it should be respected as a warning signal and not subdued. If you subdue it, it just pops up at some other point and hurts you that way. So being able to talk about it in a non-aggressive way is the key, right? If you say, hey, I'm feeling angry, or I'm starting to feel angry and I want to explore it, or something like that, that's very different from going, I'm really mad, which immediately puts your partner on the defensive, right? Because they're about to get smacked, one way, verbally or any other way. And so you don't want, so that non-aggression is an important part of conflict intimacy. And that can be hard. That takes practice, right? A lot of practice, lots of times. And you have to use conversational tricks to avoid what's called flooding, where you're emotionally out of control. If you're emotionally out of control, then you're not going to be able to non-aggressively speak, just sort of by definition. But anyway.
Quick question, Melissa.
Yeah.
Maybe you're going to get into that, but a lot of women, especially when they're in a debate or a conflict with their partner, they do get that flooding, that complete overwhelm of emotion that they either shut down or they run away screaming or crying or whatever. So can you back up just a minute and what would that person need to do or work on to stay in the moment so they can have this conversation back and forth to work these conflicts through?
Well, so the overwhelm lots of times comes because of the specific interaction that they're having. Like they start out feeling something like they're upset or they're angry, right? But anger isn't necessarily an overwhelmed kind of totally out of control anger. Sometimes it is, but lots of times it's you realize you're angry before you get to that out of control place. And the question is, how does the partner respond? So if the partner responds to your anger with defensiveness, with justifying what they're doing and that it's okay and what you're saying is not legitimate, you shouldn't be angry, something like that, if they respond with anger back, that's what escalates the conversation. If they respond with compassion or calm, that's different. Now, you may be smiling right now and going, how does that work in these relationships? Because we're not used to that. And that's the trick. It's learning the skill set that allows you to do that, right? If you're saying if the person who's speaking about the anger keeps the tone of voice in a calmer place along the scale of how calm you can be when you're angry, then and the other person works very hard and has practiced listening non-defensively, then if somebody says, I'm feeling really angry right now or really frustrated or whatever it is, then that partner can say, why? Or about what? Or, gee, I'm sorry you're feeling that way. Or, yes, I'm frustrated too, rather than, well, you shouldn't be, right? Completely different response. Well, you shouldn't be is a defensive response. And all the rest of those were not defensive responses.
Okay, let's talk about, because I'm imagining, thank you for the examples, because it really helps me to hear the exact words that people would, the alternate words that would help. But let's just set up a scenario, because what if I'm just going to use this as an ADHD, non-ADHD situation. If the non-ADHD partner is angry because the ADHD partner failed to do something, they've stumbled and fallen on the job, because that often happens in relationships. You didn't take the trash out, and now the trash is overflowing, and some simple little thing, right? So the anger is actually blame. So if I'm angry and I say, you didn't do this, so it's this kind of thing, you didn't do this again. Well, we have all these problems, blah, blah, blah. And by the way, Melissa taught me to say, I'm really angry. But it doesn't feel like just anger. It feels like it's all your fault that I'm angry because you screwed up. So how do you handle something like that?
Well, a couple different things. First of all, blame is aggressive, right? So blame is one of the things that you have to avoid if you're going to be having good conflict intimacy skills. And that's lots of times that's really hard to do. And a lot of non-ADD partners really struggle with this. Actually, so do the ADD partners in a different direction. There's a lot of blame to go around. There are a couple different strategies. One is that I tell couples, don't think about a specific incident, right? Any specific incident is likely, a conversation around a specific incident is likely to be more blame-focused. You didn't take out the trash or whatever it is. Rather, look for patterns. So hold your tongue for a specific incident, but then if you see the same thing happening over and over again, then you think about the pattern. And what you want to think about is, how is the pattern impacting you? What is it about the partners not taking out the trash that's actually the problem? And lots of times there is an internal non-blaming emotion that goes with that, like I feel really unloved, or I feel sad, or I feel lonely because it always feels as if I have all these responsibilities and I'm overwhelmed and I can't do them, something like that. Now, one of the things that I'm going to pull out here about what I just said is that those words that I use to describe that are all about me and my feelings. There are very few. So if I say, I feel unloved, that's actually about the other person. It's about whether that other person loves you or not. And that's actually why I corrected it. After I said I feel unloved, I went, oh, no, that's not the right word. Whereas if you say I feel sad or I feel lonely or whatever, those are about me personally. And that's one of the tricks of non-aggressive speaking, is to think about what is it that I feel right now, not what is it you did or what you did to me, or even ED. Lots of ED words are all about the other person, actually, not about you, which is part of the reason we interpret them as blame.
What do you mean ED words? What's that?
Like unloved, unappreciated, those kinds of ED words that are actually, the other person is doing the lack of appreciation or the lack of loving or whatever. Putting I feel in.
What does ED stand for? ED.
ED at the end of a word, like I feel loving or I feel unloved. Like one is about me and the other is about the other person and their feelings towards me. So at the ED at the end of the word, usually, often, not always, often indicates that it's actually about the other person's actions, not about your own feelings internally.
So when you look at the bigger picture, though, and I hear this all the time, as I'm sure you have, is when someone comes to you and says, my partner doesn't even understand ADD, period. So how am I going to engage him or her in this kind of communication if they don't even get it? So how would you advise that couple?
Well, so this concept doesn't rely on ADHD one way or the other. It's really, really useful in ADHD relationships because there's so many struggles in these relationships, and there's so much of this aggression in speaking. I mean, we don't think about it. When I first start working with couples, they're astounded at how aggressive their interactions are. I mean, people who think they're being, quote unquote, straightforward or forthright or whatever, are actually often very aggressive in their own, in this, blaming kind of a way. And it takes a while to readjust to this non-blaming thing. So the ADHD involvement here is that these couples are typically further in the extreme in terms of their poor communication skills for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is that they don't think, if you have an ADD and non-ADD partner, they often don't think very much alike. Their brains function differently. They work differently in terms of how they process information, what they remember, what comes up as important, all that stuff. So there's a lot of miscommunication sort of between the lines for couples impacted by ADHD, particularly if they're what I call these mixed couples, where one person assumes X is always correct and the other one has never had that experience, and so they assume Y is always correct, and they aren't very familiar with the other person's underlying assumptions, and they don't realize it for a long time. I'll give you one example.
Yeah, please.
Do you want an example of that, or should we move on to something else?
No. I would love to hear it. I would love to hear that. Thank you.
So here's one really actually very important example, which has to do with the correlation between effort and outcome. So for somebody who doesn't have ADHD, the basic correlation is the more effort, the harder work you do, the more effort you put into something, the better the outcome will be that you have. So there's a pretty direct correlation there, which is why they say if you want to do something better, you work harder. For people who have ADHD, who have had particularly unmanaged or undiagnosed ADHD, the amount of effort they put in and the outcome that they get is not always correlated. And so they might do really a lot of hard work and then have something, distractibility or something else get in the way, and the outcome is bad. They do the homework, for example, in college, but they forget to bring it to class and turn it in, and therefore they get an F. So lots of work, bad outcome. So that basic lack of correlation for people with ADHD means that it could be an extremely logical decision to not try harder to do something because that actually it won't necessarily work for them. But that to the non-ADD partner who doesn't understand that there's a very big difference in terms of their experiences seems completely illogical. Why wouldn't you just try harder, right? So a lot of those kinds of things that are different because of how their minds work are sitting in these relationships, making the communication much harder than it is for other couples. That's a very long way to say these skill sets are good for everybody, but for people, particularly important for people who have ADHD in their relationship.
So since we're talking specifically to women and about women, do women have more, especially ADHD women, do they have more trouble with these kind of communications? I mean, we mentioned flooding and that emotional response, but you're right. I mean, at least from my experience, women are a little more in touch with their feelings and may be able to verbalize them, but not always. Some ADHD women are shut down. So how does this apply to women in your experience and perhaps in your research?
Well, I think in general, as I said, women grow up with an expectation that they're going to be more in touch with their feelings. So I think the self-intimacy part for women is often easier, though everybody typically can do better in terms of being able to have that ability to identify their feelings immediately in the moment. That can be improved typically for everybody. The conflict intimacy stuff, the emotional aspect of it, the the emotional lability of people who have ADHD. In other words, the ability to become highly emotional quite quickly and maybe faster than you might normally expect. That does impact whether or not they're going to get into this aggressive speaking or defensive listening thing. And so in the conflict intimacy thing, ADHD has a very real impact. You have to work really hard to remind yourself to not be aggressive or not emotionally shut down or whatever, or to be able, this is where self-intimacy is so important. If you can say to your partner, I'm beginning to shut down, right? I'm raising my hands. I'm identifying that I'm beginning to shut down. If you have strong conflict intimacy skills as a couple, your partner should be able to say, terrific, thank you for telling me. Let's take a few minutes so you can calm down and we can reconnect around this. Rather than saying, well, you shouldn't shut down and I need to tell you this right now, and you're just going to listen, which is what happens now because the other partner isn't tuned in to, paying attention.
Really interesting. I wonder if we can move on to another because we're running out of time. It's not always the case, but sometimes I hear ADHD partners being described as having like an emotionally flatness about them by their non-ADHD partners. Can you talk about this flatness?
Yeah, I have heard that a number of different times in different arenas, and I don't buy it. I think that it is an emotional flatness. I think it is a developed habit of sort of keeping the emotions inside. My experience repeatedly is when people come to me and say my partner has ADHD and is more emotionally flat than I would expect, that typically it's two things. One, they're keeping their emotions inside, and the other thing is that they're so much in the present moment that a non-ADD partner is expecting them to, for example, hold a grudge or continue to feel angry for a really long time or whatever, and they sort of let it go, and they view that as flatness, and it's not an accurate, that's being in the moment, but that doesn't mean that they didn't feel these emotions very intentionally. So there's this sort of almost like this barbell, right? You've got people who move on very quickly from emotional upset, and sort of recalibrate to the normal, go with the flow, easygoing kind of response of being in the present moment. And then at the other end of the barbell, you've got quite a few people who are very emotionally triggerable because of the ADHD. So it's an interesting set of different folks. But I don't buy into the emotional flatness thing at all. It's not what I observe.
So we've got this base, and I noticed that the self-intimacy is the bigger, and that's really
right.
going to give you your foundation. And then you move up to conflict, which is also pretty big. But the tippy top of that little triangle is affection intimacy, and that sounds like that's where we all want to go. So do we have to go through all that stuff to get up there? Can't we just bypass all that, just jump up to the affection?
Wouldn't that be great? The issue is you can have it. So if you want to have like a steady state affection intimacy where you really feel comfortable and safe, that has to be built on the self-intimacy and the conflict intimacy. You have to know that when you have a disturbing emotion or a difficult something going on inside you, that your partner is going to be able to respond to that respectfully and without defensiveness and really take you seriously and hear you. When people say, I don't feel heard in my relationship, what they're saying actually is they have poor conflict intimacy skills in their relationship. So the affection intimacy is at the top because it's built on the other two. And one of the faster ways to get to affection intimacy, and this is why I told you the story at the beginning about why I was interested in this, is when people get the conflict intimacy part down, the affection intimacy follows quite quickly. So the couples that I was looking at that were having trouble getting to that part were still struggling with feeling safe in how they conversed with each other and feeling that they could sort of bring anything forward and be themselves, essentially. So they had gotten ADHD treatment sort of under control, and they had sort of calmed down their conversations, but they still didn't feel safe. And that's why they couldn't get up to that affection intimacy part. So that, in terms of importance, the top part is the most important, and therefore, if I were going to diagram importance, it would be equal in size or bigger. maybe like a T, with the affection, intimacy across the top and sitting on the other two. But it takes the other skills to get there. And then there's this strong connection and the strong sense of, whatever happens, we're going to be able to get through it.
And so people, I'm sure, kind of go back and forth, though, right? I mean, you can't. Affection, intimacy isn't always there, or is it in great relationships?
I think it is there. Like there may be some things that your partner make you crazy about your partner always, just because they do things so differently from you, right? But when you get to that affection, intimacy stage, they don't bug you particularly. You observe and you sort of go, oh yeah, well that's my partner, so what, And so once you've got, I think the ins and outs of affection are for people who are still struggling with feeling safe. Like, you can feel affection for a while, but then something happens that triggers you back into this unsafe place, and then you're not sure. But if you get to a strong, what they call mature conflict intimacy, then the safety is there. It doesn't matter what comes up in the relationship. You know that even if the conversation is going to be difficult or maybe even protracted, you're still going to be able to get through it. And that confidence means the affection intimacy stays in place, and that and strengthens
trust.
That.
It sounds like
it is to a large degree. I mean, there are issues with trust. So trust in the dimension of being able to talk with somebody about anything, right? And you might hear in those conversations things you really don't want to hear, or that you have to look at in yourself, or that are hard to, really, really hard to hear, like your partner has been thinking about having an affair or something like that. I mean, all sorts of stuff could come forward that's really awful. That's the ability to handle things together and work through them respectfully is one element of trust. If you look at trust for people with ADHD based upon, are they going to complete XYZ task? And that's the only thing that you base your trust in, you're in trouble, because, sometimes distractibility or something else, the system that you've got to make sure you do something doesn't serve you in one day or whatever. And that then is not a particularly good basis for trust in these relationships, even though it is often a component for non-ADHD relationships with other non-ADHD people. So trust is another topic. I talk about that in my couples seminar, among other things. So.
Well, this is all fascinating information and very, very helpful, and I want to thank you, Melissa. But could you maybe sum up something important that you would like for this to be a takeaway for those of us who are watching you today?
Well, so I think it's really, first of all, I'm thrilled to be here, and thank you very much. I think it's just this idea of non-aggressive speaking and looking to yourself for not speaking aggressively to your partner, which doesn't mean hiding your feelings. That's not at all what I'm talking about, but delivering them in a way that's not aggressive. And then on the other side of the equation, listening with an open thing, and as soon as you start to feel defensive, raising your hand and saying, hold on, I'm starting to feel defensive, let me calm back down and open myself back up again. But those two ideas are really, really important in terms of creating a relationship which you really love to be in, which is the kind of relationship we all thought we wanted to go into. And so that, I would urge people to think about that next time they're talking with their partner and say, how am I doing on those two things, non-aggressive and non-defensive? Where am I? And look at that. Very useful.
Yeah, so I just want to add to what Melissa just said, that I have to tell you that in my relationship, we came from a place of being completely on, the far end of non-communication to, without using those words, to kind of the exact what you're talking about, the affection, intimacy. And I just want to reassure people that even though it sounds impossible, it really did sound impossible to us, that with help and with practice, you really can get there. And, of course, please look to Melissa's website and her seminars for help with that, because that really is what you need. You have to kind of be immersed in it for a while in order to really get it into your own relationship, to get it into you and then get it into your own relationship. And the other piece of that is that it takes two people to do this. One person standing up and doing it makes it the whole relationship fall down. It takes two people to do this. So commitment's really important too. Would you agree with that, Melissa?
I would totally agree with that, and we had the same experience where we were in a situation where we never, ever thought that we would be able to have this kind of situation, and we do. And it is because we both decided to dig in and make it happen. You cannot do this by yourself. This is only able to be done if both partners are committed to making these changes. So,
Melissa, before we say goodbye, how can people reach you? How can they connect with you?
Yeah, how do they get there?
Well, also at my website, which is ADHDmarriage.com, it's also for people who aren't married, so that's somewhat of a misnomer. And I do have a lot of resources there for couples impacted by ADHD. This is just one area that I work in, but I've got a lot of information about treatment for couples where one or both partners has ADHD. How do you optimize the treatment? I've got my couples seminar, which is really, really helpful for a lot of couples now at this point. It's really a great resource. Books, others, all sorts of stuff. So they should definitely come, check it out, and we'll be delighted to have you there.
We're so delighted that you were here today. And perhaps even for the third annual ADHD Palooza next year. We are
Hopefully.
So excited. This is really, really important. Relationships are so important, so we are especially grateful to have you here today. Thank you for joining us, and thank you, everyone, for listening in and tuning in. We will see you on the next session. Much, much more to come. Thanks.
Yeah.